You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Okay, cool. So, folks listening at home, this is actually a very special taping of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by me, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record. It feels good saying that again after a while. Um, we're recording this because in the process of putting out season two, when it came time to edit the original production of this episode, we're of course looking at Star Trek The Next Generation season two, episode 21, Peak Performance. Unfortunately, only 15 minutes are recorded before the audio completely cuts off in general. So unfortunately, we had to come back and re-record this. So Jake, thank you so much for coming back. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good, Jay. How about you?
I'm doing really well. It's a funny thing because even though um, I am sad that our first attempt at this did not succeed, I think the second attempt is going to be better, and I think that we're looking at a great episode of early TNG to really dive into it tonight. So, before we get started, we're looking at, of course, peak performance. As I mentioned, it's Star Trek The Next Generation season two, episode 21, the penultimate episode before Shades of Grey, which is the season finale of season two, and I have to say, probably one of the less enjoyable season finales. But this debuted on July 10th of 1989 when it first aired and had an in-world star date of 42923.4, which is also in the year 2365. And I just have to say I love this episode. I think one thing that we identified when we first recorded Where No Bubs has Gone Before, and we were talking about the first two seasons, is that the first two seasons of Star Trek: The Next Generation are not necessarily the best seasons because they're still trying to figure out how to write the shows. Um, for example, in the first season, we see a lot of episodes that have sometimes two or three main storylines, along with some minor
Hmm.
storylines, where I actually think that this episode in particular strikes a really good balance where there's kind
Hmm.
of two main storylines at play, plus kind of a smaller one involving Wesley Crusher. But I think Peak Performance is one of the better expressions of early Star Trek The Next Generation. I think it's a lot of fun. I think all the characters have something cool to do, and it's one of those ensemble episodes where everyone shines, and it's just fun. I think looking back at it narratively, though, I was watching it again today, and one thing that struck me is that even though it's structurally sound and is actually a pretty good story, and we'll touch on this, the Ferengi at the end kind of come out of nowhere, and there's very much kind of like a surprise at in the last 10 minutes of this episode that I think's fun, but at the same time, looking back at it, kind of just comes out of nowhere. But before we continue, Dad, what do you think about it?
Well, I'm looking at my notes from, I don't remember when we did
Oh, years
uh,
ago.
years ago now, but I had the notes that that this episode was another diversion to a
Hmm.
war game exercise.
That's right.
And we talked about how they would, you know, have these they were, as you said, they're trying to figure out, storylines that would continue through a season and things like that. And
Right.
I guess they really hadn't done this in season two. So this was something, creative that they came up with before the end of the season.
Right. Um, it's funny that you mention that because one thing that I was thinking about recently, when it comes to this episode. there is a line later on in the episode when when Picard confronts Cole Rami about Riker's ability to be a captain, not just a first officer, and Jean-Luc Picard says, "In my time in Starfleet, he's the finest officer I've ever seen." One thing that I've kind of been struck by, um, I don't think that we realize that for like a lot of these characters, the bulk of their career happens in 7 seasons or essentially 7 years time, give or take. And if
Hmm.
you're not leaving out the movies, um, I think, all of these diversions that you mentioned, one thing that we noticed when we were first recording where No Bubs has gone before, is that often the flagship of the Federation is asked to go off on these diversions that kind of deviate from the main mission, which seems to be exploration and diplomacy, if you ask Jean-Luc Picard later on what the purpose is for Starfleet. But the diversion here is actually interesting because it's tied back to one of the episodes at the very beginning of season 2. I think it might be Q Who. It's the one where
Hmm.
Q introduces them to the Borg, and the
Right.
reason they're having the war games, and I think it's called the Bratislava sector, the
Mm.
sector.
Hmm.
Sorry, folks. The Braslota system. The
Mm.
Braslota system with an L. They're having these war games involving the Enterprise, which is, of course, the flagship of the Federation, with the 80-year-old USS Hathaway, which is kind of this inferior ship that's been brought out of mothballs to be a testing ship or a war game ship. And they're having these war games because of the threat of the newly discovered Borg. And, I kind of want to open this episode up with kind of a debate that we've had before, but we haven't had it in a while, and this is a good place to have it. Um, when they are introducing the idea of having these war games and the Zach Dorn,
Hmm.
God, what was his name? I just want to get his Cerna Kolrami. That's right. I always mess up
Hmm.
his first name, Cerna
Hmm.
Kolrami. When Cerna Kolrami shows up, one thing that Picard expresses is that while he thinks that Starfleet is an explorator, is an exped, uh, their job is to explore and to commit to intergalactic diplomacy. The meeting with the Borg has created this situation where they need to brush up on their military skills. And it brings us to this question, I think, something we'll discuss now. What is Starfleet as an organization? Because we've covered this many times before, but we can cover it here. They're always having this debate on what their purpose is as an organization. In this one, it's very clear that Starfleet itself, since they have a specialist and they have a ship that they can provide, has some idea that they're a military organization as well as a diplomatic and exploratory one. What do you think?
I think I think that they, you know, Starfleet has different purposes, and we've, discussed this before. Exploration is certainly one. Um, Diplomacy is something in terms of, looking at whether civilization is developing warp so that, they can use prime directive rules so that they can make contact with them. And then, of course, there's the military side. And
Hmm.
it's really interesting. We're recording this on December 30th, 2025. And I heard something yesterday, a news report talking about the current uh, administration of the United States, the Trump administration, has this idea that they want to develop a new class of battleships.
Yeah,
And
I've heard of this.
the comment was that, putting that aside, is that uh, there's questions whether you need to have a battleship, something that's big like that. But one of the part of the
Right.
discussion was that the Navy has currently, the U.S. Navy has different missions that it can be military, of course, can be offensive, it can be defensive in that
Hmm.
fashion, it can be humanitarian,
Hmm.
it can be diplomatic just by, basically gunboat diplomacy. You
Yes.
put a naval vessel off somebody's coast, and that can sort of threaten them and cause them to back down on things and things of that. So even in the U.S. Navy today, we see that they have multiple roles. Exploration really doesn't come into it. They could, but they don't because we've still, I think, only mapped like 5% of the ocean floor. We know more about the surface of the moon than we know what's on the bottom of our seas on this planet.
And without going off on a huge political and social economics dovetail about that, a lot of undersea exploration has been left to private enterprise, which in itself
Yes,
is a problem within
right,
itself. Like for every
right.
James Cameron, there's 100 people out there who want to explore the ocean for nefarious means.
Yes,
Um,
sure.
the thing is though, like as you were citing, not only the military but the Army Corps of Engineers,
Right.
the Hurricane Hunters, which I believe are Air Force, um,
Yes.
the U.S. military throughout all of its branches, I believe the Coast Guard has an amphibious science project that's taken upon itself for a while now. But all the branches of the military conduct some sort of medical or scientific research that is often available to the public. So, this kind of combination of having a diplomatic, militaristic, and science-based or exploratory organization is not necessarily out of the blue. Like we've had these in real
Right.
life for a long time.
Right.
I think philosophically, the interesting thing that Picard is trying to push forward in this, of course, the 24th century, is that Starfleet's primary purpose is not military, and
Right.
he philosophically believes that it
Right.
should not go towards the military, which is
Yes.
interesting if you think about. So Christmas presents arrived today, and thank you and Mom for
Mhm.
the complete collection of TNG on DVD. I also got from Margot for Christmas the complete DS9.
DS9, I
Uh,
heard.
uh,
Yeah. Right.
I mentioned DS9 because not only is there going to be a DS9 show for me one of these days soon, but um, in DS9, it's very clear after the Battle of Wharf 359, which of course is a big battle that affects the life of Benjamin Sisko as well. Um, Starfleet kind of goes whole hog in terms of developing technology and war technology to fight the Borg. I mean, that's where they come up with the construction of the Defiant.
Mhm.
Um, the entire idea that Starfleet somehow did not have this kind of wartime footing. During Archer's time, apparently Archer's Enterprise dealt with the first Earth Romulan War. Um, Kirk, of course, Kirk and his crew fought the Klingon, like two different versions of a Klingon war. So the
Mhm.
the idea that I think Roddenberry and the writers at the time put forth, in 1983 or 1984 when this comes out,
1989. Right.
oh, 1989, sorry.
Yeah.
Um, when this comes out in 89, I think it's very interesting to see this kind of anti-war push a little bit from the show because the show has had war footing before. It's just never glorified war. And I don't think
Hmm.
it does here in this episode either, which, I have to say is very good because it allows us to explore the the character of Commander Riker in a way. And one of the big and kind of shifting to the next topic, one of the big questions and concerns of this episode, which is kind of the main sticking point between Picard and I want to say Zoran Mamdani, but it's Sirna Karami. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Kohlrabi. Right.
I
Yeah.
actually voted for Mamdani, so like
Yeah.
I shouldn't. Pardon, but um, one thing that I think is interesting is that there's this evaluation of William Riker going on whether or not he's ready for Starfleet command. But it's it's an interesting, I think, scenario that they put him in, where on one hand they're expecting the crew of the Enterprise to take part in these war games exercises to benefit the crew of the Enterprise, but there's also this evaluation of is this guy going to be captain here soon? And I kind of forget that through the first season and the second season, there is always this big question of, is Riker going to take command? Is Riker going to leave the Enterprise? And I just don't think it's as kind of apparent upon first viewing as it is in other as it was in later viewings, including the most recent one I took. But what do you think about the storyline around Commander Riker and just the entire idea of whether or not he's worthy for a captain seat at this point?
Well, I haven't watched the episode recently. I'm just, commenting from my notes. But as I'm looking at them, one of the things I'm thinking about, there sort of is a theme in terms of the war game and also the stratagema game
Yes,
that Mr. Kolrami engages in with Riker and then Data. And it gets into, I mean, the strategies are somewhat simple in that with a war game, you want the Enterprise to um, you know, triumph over or defeat the Hathaway. That whole situation changes when the Ferengi show up.
right.
And then it switches over from strategy to tactics, which are very much related.
Yes,
Strategic is a large goal. Tactics are what the things that you do to achieve that goal. And the strategy issue comes out in the final game that
hmm
Data and Kolrami has, because we'll talk about that, what Data does to confuse Kolrami and actually sort of win
right.
the game. But I think that what happens as the story progresses in terms of Riker being a potential commanding officer, the way he ends up handling the Ferengi and what he does with the Hathaway, with what
Yeah,
Wesley Crusher does, is just a great tactic and so forth, and shows the tactical creativity that Riker is capable of. I mean, and one of the notes I put is there's at one point Riker and Worf have a conversation about
yes.
the Kobayashi Maru concept, and when the Ferengi show up, what Riker does with Wesley's help is sort of a Kobayashi Maru in a sense.
Yeah, in a large sense. I'm actually looking for the quote here because I have let's see. Forge and Riker. Uh, uh, Essentially what Riker says, when you're outgunned, you're outclassed, what do you have left? And Worf
Hmm.
says you have guile.
Dial, right.
And one thing that I think is very interesting about the entire scenario that they're putting Riker in is, you mentioned it for a second, and then it struck me for a moment how this scenario doesn't necessarily work. I came in here saying how much I love this episode, now I'm taking it apart. Um, so like the when we're introduced to the Borg in the earlier Q episode in season 2, one of the things that's very apparent from the get-go is that the Borg just outmatches the Enterprise. And if the Enterprise is
Right.
the cutting edge technology of the Federation, they're screwed once the Borg show up. So the entire scenario of this war game is that the Enterprise has to defeat the Hathaway, or the Hathaway has to defeat the Enterprise. But they're putting Riker in this scenario where he has an obviously defunct ship that is nowhere near superior to the Enterprise. I mean, it's 80 years old compared to the Enterprise.
Right. Right.
And they're expecting him to beat it, but if you look at the scenario, it doesn't necessarily make sense. If anything, they should have brought in a better ship or a series of ships to try to mimic what the Enterprise is going to be facing. Because when Riker fights the Borg, as we see later on in Best of Both Worlds, um, he's not using an 80-year-old ship. He's going to be using the flagship when he temporarily
Hmm.
takes over. And
Hmm.
it just struck me now that, like, what is this war game actually testing besides Riker's creativity? It's not really testing whether or not the actual crew itself is ready to deal with a massive challenge that is the Borg. That said, you brought up strategy and tactics, and I think one thing that this episode does really well is explore some of those notions. Like, touching on Stratagema for a moment, which is this
Sure.
Zach Dorn game, it seems, that has been
Hmm.
created where you seem to use some sort of sensory input involving your fingers and
Hmm.
maybe your mind somehow, because it seems like there's an eye aspect to it,
Right.
and you essentially try to fill in squares before your opponent fills in squares, and it takes you to different levels. Of course, I don't have any rules. I never wrote down any rules. I'm
Right.
just giving people what I think the observation is. Correct me if it sounds
That
wrong,
that sounds
but
good.
but
Yeah.
it sounds in some ways like a geometric chess. Like you're
Yeah.
supposed to create shapes that outdo your opponent.
And,
Um,
and it moves very fast.
yes, very fast. Um, Almost like the game Go in a sense.
Yes.
Like it's an intergalactic version of Go. The thing is, Riker is so brilliant at the very beginning, and I think one of the problems with the episode is that there's no question if Riker's ready to be captain. Because I think it's brilliant. One of the first things he does is he challenges Cole Rami to this game of Stratagema,
Hmm.
and he's walking down the corridor to tend forward to fight, well, to battle Cole Rami, and Geordi's like, "Are you going to win?" And Riker's like, "Nope." Are you even going to try? Nope. Do you have any chance at all? Not at all. And it's basically like one of the things that I think people forget about warfare and game theory sometimes because they often get crossed is that games are not at you can play games to prepare yourself for war, but war itself is not a bunch of actual games. Like you can play chess, like generals used to play chess for strategic thinking, but war itself is not chess. War itself is not Go. And, but the one thing that Riker's doing is he's discovering how quickly Paul Rami is going to come after him. He's using the game to deduce the methodology and the approach of his opponent, which I think is really, really smart without actually having to give away what he's doing or talking about it. And I think the
Can I
show actually does a really good job with it.
can I give you a quick real story that
Absolutely.
kind of
That's what this is here
delineates the
for.
difference between strategy and tactics? I have two cousins, Dick Moser and Ken Reckward, that every Friday morning they play online chess.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I recently had to go to Florida and I stayed with my cousin. He was telling me that most of the time Ken wins because he was a chess club guy in high school and all this. And sometimes Dick wins, but the last three games, Dick had won because they used the timer that you only get
Yes.
45 minutes to make your all of your moves.
Hmm.
And Ken is more methodical in his moves, while Dick, being a West Pointer, I think, in turn learning blitzkrieg and things like
Hmm.
that the faster you can move ahead of your enemy and to put them off guard and so forth, the better you'll do. So Dick had won the last three games.
Hmm.
So the next game, though, I talked to my cousin Dick. Ken figured it out. He said he set the parameters of the game up and said, "We're not going to have the timer on this game," and he
Yeah.
won.
Yes.
So this is an example where, he had a strategy where he knew that he needed to take the time off or take the timer off. And then he had plenty of time tactically to decide his moves better and so on.
Right. And the beauty of that is that Dick, and then kind of Ken to a certain extent, do what Riker do and try to improve upon their game versus each other
Yes.
in these various forms. Like one thing that I find interesting though about like the kind of going back to the game comparison and how game comparisons I think sometimes don't work when it comes to actual combat and war and stuff like that. Um, when Riker finally gets on the Hathaway, he selects a crew that has, of course, Worf and Geordi and some other people, but of course he takes Wesley along with him. the preparation of the Hathaway is not actually about getting their tactics ready. It's about finding new ways to break the game so they can win it in
Hmm.
unexpected fashion. And they kind
Right.
of do things that, you can't do in an actual game itself. You can't go outside and like flout the rules. Like Worf comes up with this ingenious idea of accessing the imaging system in the Enterprise using a code, and is able to project the illusion of a Romulan warbird attacking the Enterprise at
Mm-hmm.
one point.
Hmm.
That's cheating. Like that's cheating. Um,
Kobayashi Maru, right?
but that's the thing. But that's the thing. Like to win, sometimes you have to cheat.
Right.
Wesley Crusher, for example, 15-year-old genius ass Wesley Crusher, decides that I was making antimatter for homework, so I just need to go back to the Enterprise and get some antimatter so we can power this warp engine that's
Right.
been in mothballs for 80 years. But like stuff like that is not only like, if in many ways, like Wesley took part in one of the key aspects of war by using subterfuge
Hmm.
and duplicity to actually maintain and achieve an objective.
Right.
Um, one thing that I love about this as well is that, there's this kind of
Oh,
what
one quick
yeah,
comment is
absolutely.
when you talk about Worf projecting the Romulan ship and um, Wesley getting the antimatter so they could have a short burst of warp speed. That's a good example of guile.
Yes.
Since we use that term is used in the episode.
Yeah, I absolutely. Well, I also think that like one thing that the episode does a very good job of, and we'll get into it when we jump into the conversation about data, is that conflict and competition and war and combat and all these things come down to a few things that really matter. It comes down to preparation and mindset. And on one hand, like, you have, I think on one half of the narrative in this story, you have Riker, whose story is about preparation and mindset. And the mindset, like, okay, I'm in a bad situation. I can win if I prepare myself correctly and come up with something that my opponent does not have. On the other side of this story, I think you have the opposite of that. I think you have Data, who appears as this, once again, kind of like the Enterprise, technologically infallible, equipped with all of these tools that no human, including Riker, has, no other living creature on the ship has. Um, and, you know, all of this knowledge and data already of strategy and tactics that he has obviously poured over and over again, but he's lacking confidence because when he is unjustly volunteered by Dr. Pulaski to play stratagemer against
Mm,
Kolrami because um, Pulaski thinks that Kolrami needs to be taken down a peg or two and only an android can do
mhm,
it. He loses, and in losing, he
mhm,
has this gigantic lack of confidence in himself and this breaking of his ability of faith in himself to perform as a first officer, not only to Picard but be a person in general. It's actually a really fascinating moment of the
mhm,
episode. But one thing that I think it handles is that even if you are the most equipped, even if you are the most able, if you don't have the correct mindset and you are unconfident of your ability to perform, it doesn't matter how good you are. You will not perform well. And I think, when we finally get to Picard giving his lesson of, life is full of, well, I actually have a quote right here, so sorry folks, I'm gonna look at it. Don't worry,
mhm.
we'll delete this when it becomes time.
It is possible to make no mistakes and still
Yes,
lose.
yes, that it is impossible to make mistakes and still lose. That is not a failure, that is life.
Yes.
And I think that that is an important thing that Riker is able to accept, that you can lose and still make improvements and still move on from it, which is illustrated in him losing to Kolrami. In losing Kolrami, he already has the attitude and the confidence that, like, okay, I can lose the game to this guy. I'm going to win the actual battle against him. Where if Data loses a game, Data can't win the battle. And
Are
it's
you
this kind.
are you saying that Riker, in terms of stratagema, Riker loses, but in terms of the war game, since
Yeah,
um, Kolrami's kind of setting up the parameters, Riker ends up winning there.
I'll make an example of this. And
Sure.
I have a friend. I love him to death. He's one of my best friends. You might know him. He was in my wedding. I'll let people
Mm,
guess if they ever guess. I'll tell you later. But he is a fan of like strategy games. Like he's a big fan of Go. He's been playing Go for the last 3 years,
mm.
and he keeps talking to me about, and he's great at Go. He beats everyone. But he keeps talking to me like, generals used to use Go as a way to prepare themselves for war. And I look at it this way like, okay, you can beat me in a game of Go. I can still kick your ass. And that's Riker right there. Kolrami can beat him in a game of stratagema. Games don't mean anything if you really stop and think about it. Like me and you playing chess, if you beat me, fine. If I beat you, fine. No one's dying. No one's losing their ship. No one's losing their command. No one's losing the war. Riker has to go to actual battle at the end of this episode against the Enterprise. He does not look at stratagema as determining his worth as a tactician or a
Good point.
strategist or an
Good
officer.
point.
Where
Sure.
despite all of his infallibility, and we've discussed multiple times how we think Data is more human than he realizes.
Right. Right.
Um, but one of the things that Data does that is very human, and a lot of humans fail to do, is they cannot assign. And this is going to sound muddy, and I'm probably going to fuck it up, but I think this is real. Some humans sometimes have, as human beings, we sometimes have a really hard time assigning appropriate value to things when it comes to what we need to get done in our life. We hold out this idea that if we aren't good at this one little thing, everything else falls apart and we can't be good at anything else. If we can't perform at this one thing, everything else has to somehow be less than for it. And that's just not true. Data not being able to play a game well and lose does not mean that he is actually a poor officer or a poor person or unable. But we have this thinking as human beings that if we can't play a game really well, we can't do other things really well. And Riker does not have that. Riker has either lost enough games or been in enough fights or been in enough conflicts to know that, like, hey, what matters now is what happens when we actually get to the battlefield, not the chess game I played 30 minutes beforehand or 3 days beforehand, where there are people who will lose that chess game and just think about it for the next 3 days, like Data does, and then lose the battle when they get to the battlefield.
Well, it goes back to Picard's statement. It is possible to make no mistakes and still lose.
Right.
If you understand that principle, then what you can do is learn from it.
Yes.
And, going back to the original Kobayashi Maru story with Kirk, he, I think he supposedly took the Kobayashi Maru test twice and lost twice. Something in one of
Yes.
the movies they say that. But then, the third time, the fourth time, whatever, he figures I can win, but I'm going to change the premise because I'm going to cheat.
Yes.
I'm going to screw up the computer program. So he wins in that way. And of course they say he's cheating and everything, but he won. And that's what happens with Data. He very much self-examines, like, how could I lose and so forth. And then he kind of learns from it, which is again, part of the humanness of him, where he gets over his loss and says, well, this guy's really good. I can't beat him. But if I just change the premise so that I'm going to go get a draw, that will frustrate the hell out of Kolrami because he can't win. And he's so confident in himself, he thinks he's going to win.
Well,
And
it's
once he sees that, I'm staying up with him, and Karami just collapses.
well, Kolrami's entire strategy is based off this idea of overwhelming aggression to overwhelm
Right,
your opponent and in the game immediately. He's not
right.
prepared to play the game for 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Yes,
He's not prepared to play the game with a timer, so to speak.
right. Yeah, exactly.
But one thing that I think also Picard is saying that I kind of want to reflect on something that you can do everything perfect and still lose. There is a movie where Kirk has to deal with the Kobayashi Maru and the fact that he cheated and the fact that he didn't do it the right way and the fact that he didn't accept the ultimate lesson that Picard is hitting on here. You can do everything right and still lose. And Kirk finally learns this in The Wrath of Khan because they talk about it because at the beginning of Wrath of Khan, he and Spock are leading cadets through the Kobayashi Maru. The the crew that they take on the Enterprise to face Khan Noonien Singh, who's taken over the USS Reliant, is an Academy crew that was in the middle of their Kobayashi Maru exams. And
Mhm.
he thinks like, is there a way for me to cheat to get out of this? Is there a way for me to pull some sort of gambit? It's like, no, at some point you lose. At some point, people are going to die. At some point, your best friend's going to die. Spock's going to die because of decisions you make. That's the other part of
Mhm.
command too. Some
Mhm.
point you're and Picard knows this too from his time on the Stargazer. You're going to run into something that's just going to beat you. You're not going to
Mhm.
win. You're just not going to
Mhm.
win. It's kind of like I kind of look at it like car crashes. They happen, and when they happen, you just can't, if you're very lucky, you're okay, but bad things also happen. It's the same
Mhm.
thing with cancer or being scammed out of your money or a health situation happening or someone in your family dying. Like these things just happen and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You just have to figure out how to do your best in the situation at hand as it's happening, which is also a lesson of Kobayashi Maru, which is kind of like die while working. Like instead of sitting there and panicking and wondering how how am I going to die so
Mhm.
terribly. And I think Andy Weir in The Martian touches on this really well too, both in the book and the movie. Like Matt Damon's character at some point is like, I just have to keep working. I have to keep working. If I keep working, I stay alive. If I keep working, I can find a way off Mars. If I keep working, the idea that Kobayashi Maru teaches you is that like you have to keep working even though you might die in the next moment. Because if you keep working, you might figure out a way not to die in the next moment.
The the um the end of The Martian, when Matt Damon's character, I forget who's the character's name, it's on the tip of my tongue, tip of my brain. He's
I know
talking
it's
to
been a
new
while.
he's talking to new astronaut trainees, and he says, space, it will try to kill you, but
Yes.
all you can do is solve one problem and then go on to the next and go on to the next and go on to the next. And
Yes.
it's not admitting defeat, it's realizing that you might be defeated, but the only way to deal with it is solve the most immediate problem, then go to the next, etc. And if
Correct.
you think about it, in terms of, you go back to, I've been seeing some YouTube videos of what life would be like a million years ago. And,
Oh yeah.
when you had Homo erectus and things like that, it was survive every minute, every
Oh
day.
my God. Yeah. Well, like someone was making a point about Homo erectus. It's funny that you bring this up, but we have likely caused the extinction of more creatures than we will ever be able to know or remember in
Mhm.
history. And if you think about why those extinctions occurred, some of those creatures probably died because they were direct predators to humans. Like
Mhm.
There, a million years ago, you bring up Homo erectus, and we now have it. We now have archaeological confirmation that humans were around potentially a million years ago.
Sure.
Um, we all have this idea of humans hiding out in caves and trying to fight off bears and saber-toothed tiger, but like they were probably trying to fight off bears and saber-toothed tiger and
Mhm.
sickness and larger creatures. Like, I have to imagine if you were among the early original African peoples that were living along riverlands and you had
Mhm.
to deal with
Mhm.
snakes and crocodiles. Of course, you have dragons and serpents. Um,
Right.
yeah, well, no, I mean, I think
Yeah,
people
I
don't.
understand.
Well, like one thing that I've. This is a weird aside, but it ties into what we're talking about. One thing that I've been really curious about recently is okay, we've had vaccination since really kind of mid 20th century. Like vaccines have really been around since the mid 20th century and started to proliferate
Mhm.
more and more from that.
Mhm.
And no one can deny that vaccines were a huge boost to human civilization because children did not have to die where they used to
Mhm.
die in droves.
Mhm.
But I bring up this question because, there's this question that a historian friend of mine posed that if you took someone today who had modern hygiene practices, who understand modern health practices, who had understands kind of you know, germ theory and just proper ways of sanitation and cleanliness, could you send a modern human back to, let's say, 1349 and they survive the plague? And there's an argument that maybe they could because they have all of these inherited immunities that their ancestors during 1349 wouldn't have. Um, if they wash themselves every day and if they take care of their clothes and if they avoid fleas, sure, because one theory we have now is that it takes massive fleas to infect someone, not just one. Um, at the same time, it just leads to the question, like before vaccinations and throughout the history of the world, were people just sick? Like, was everyone dealing like walking around with a low grade fever or a cold or
Mhm.
something we just don't know about?
Mhm.
And I think one thing that this kind of gets to is human human experience and the human story involves so much trauma we don't know about, and this kind of idea of like, hey, you're not going to win all of them. Some of them you're really going to lose. The only thing you can do is to keep surviving, keep trying, and keep learning from your mistakes if you can survive them,
Mhm.
and hope that not only
Yes.
do you progress, but your children progress from those mistakes because you teach them
Right.
this is the thing
Right.
I did wrong. Here's how not to do it wrong again. I think that those are such. I think they're not only timeless lessons, I think they're in some ways biological lessons
Mhm.
that I think if we as humans forget, there's a reason why we have such strong reactions. I think one of the reasons why Data, even though he's an android, has such strong reactions to losing is because humans have something wired in them to where losing meant something back then. Losing a
Mhm.
game, American Indians used to play
I,
lacrosse games to
I was thinking the
it,
same thing. Yeah,
just
exactly.
imagine being an Indian during those lacrosse games and your tribe loses and you lose like territory because of it because
Yeah.
they
Right.
use lacrosse games to like
It was a
resolve
board game.
conflicts. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Right.
but imagine your team loses and all of a sudden you don't have a house anymore. So,
Right.
there's something about conflict and competition that does very strange things to us that I think go back to more than just, oh, when we started playing games. It goes back to our basic survival. And I
Hmm.
think one
Hmm.
of the beautiful things that like this episode does, and Picard's lesson in particular does, is kind of show us that, as humans, we do have to accept kind of our vulnerabilities and our and the fact that we are very fallible and that we can lose. I think that is such an important lesson to have. But also, the other lesson is that even in the face of losing, trying your best really does matter. And doing your
Hmm.
best in a terrible situation really does matter.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, is there anything that you want to address? Because I think we're
Let's see.
oh, I know what I want to talk about. So we've kind of touched on this idea of data being infallible and data having, this kind of self-doubt, but kind of getting on what I was just touching on a little bit, do you think that, his self-doubt is an expression of his humanity?
Yes, I do.
So I bring this up. I bring this up for a very important reason because when we first recorded this episode, we were not living in an age of readily available AI tools like we are
True.
now.
Right.
And there are some people who believe that if you look at these large language models, these chat
Hmm.
bots,
Hmm.
and I read this today, there's a chat bot specialist at Google who believes that the AIs are starting to act in measures of self-preservation, and we may need to have to pull the plug on them.
We've talked about that, or I've read about that too.
Yes. Um, but it puts data, I think, into a very different conversation for us because now we kind of have an algorithm or we have an algorithmic model that would feature in an Android to a certain extent. Like data needs language. He would have a large language model in his positronic matrix to help him do what he's doing. Now, of course, he would have much more than that, but you know, we're already seeing LLMs express self-doubt. We're already seeing LLMs hallucinate. We're already seeing LLMs
Mm.
do things that even though we can kind of pare it down to the fact that like, oh, there's trouble in the code or there's trouble in the neural nets, which are kind of like the connections of different nodes that it's a brain thing, folks. Um, what I'm trying to get to is when we first had this conversation, we didn't have kind of a baseline of technology to talk about in comparison to data. We do now. Um, when you think about, when we see LLMs showing self-preservation, when we show LLMs having doubts or making mistakes, and then you see data, do you have any reflections on this now that we have these kind of tools?
As we're talking about this, it goes back to I remember freshman year when I went back to Lexington, Virginia from Christmas and New Year's break, the day before second semester classes started. Only time I went to movie theater when I went to Washington Lee was on um, January 3rd or something like that. And we went to see uh, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And what I'm thinking of is just that as HAL 9000 knows that Dave is turning him down, not turning him off, but turning some of his functions down. He
Hmm.
says, Dave, will I dream?
Yeah.
So here's an AI. I mean, HAL 9000 was an AI. He was running the ship and so forth. And how human is that for the AI to say, you're talking about self-preservation. Will I dream? What could be more human for an AI to think of and think whether it would dream or not?
Yes. Well, like it so I am preparing a presentation for this kind of live event that's happening in New York. I'm going to go and present on this book called Capital Realism by Mark Fisher. And it's basically talking it without going to this huge thing. Capital realism is this idea that capitalism has become so pervasive, it has set itself up as basically as this idea that it is the basic necessity for modern human existence and that everything else that tries to challenge it is trying to challenge modern human existence. So the idea is that what else is there besides capitalism? We can't think of anything else because we've reached this perfect thing, but it's clearly not a perfect thing.
Mm,
And
mhm.
the challenge of capital realism is to challenge this notion that capitalism is inevitable because capitalism is going to lead us to one to two places. And I kind of and I really do think this because I think Star Trek bores this out too. Um, we're either going to be in techno-feudal landscapes ruled by self-appointed messianic technocrats, or
Mm,
we're going to be in Fallout, which is a post-apocalyptic video game series where we are all suffering in a wasteland ruled by self-appointed messianic technocrats. Um, I think,
who currently own, like, I forget the numbers, but the billionaire class owns more,
oh,
has more
they own three
assets.
times the wealth than the bottom 80% of the
Yes,
global community.
right, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, like
It's
it,
so out of balance. Yes.
well, it's you can't sit here and, well, we're getting way off topic, trying to get back on topic for the sake of the so we have these LLMs and they're doing all these things, and then we see data doing all these things. And I think, if we can have this conversation outside of the political sphere we're in now or the social sphere where
Hmm.
people listening to this are going to either be, oh, AI is the greatest thing in the world, or AI is the worst thing to ever happen and no one should use it whatsoever. The reality always falls in the middle. Um, Sometimes fortunately, sometimes unfortunately. But I think in terms of
Hmm.
right now in this conversation, I, one thing that I'm coming to realize when I look at the development of these LLMs and maybe with data is that, Dr. Sung, Data's father, basically creates a human. We, by creating LLMs, are basically creating on a very basic level, because I do not want to assign this idea that they are sentient yet or that they have
Hmm.
cognition, because I think
Hmm.
because one thing that I think is happening right now, which is why the AI experiment is failing and why we're going to have an economic crash, is because when you hear these AI titans talk about super intelligence or reaching artificial general intelligence, they're essentially saying that they want to create an AI or an LLM that has the perfect match for human capabilities, at least on a language or linguistic scale, which,
Hmm.
if you can have human capability from a piece of technology on a linguistic scale, you can do a lot, folks, because language defines so much of our existence. That said, when they say AGI, I think that they mean data, but I don't think that they realize that more goes into data than just scraping the internet and throwing it into a large language model. A
Hmm.
lot goes into data in terms of experience. A lot goes into data in terms of design and repair. And one thing that I keep thinking about is, if I don't think that we reach AGI in the next 5 years. I don't think OpenAI does that. I don't think Google does that. I don't think Meta does it. I don't think that we reach AGI or super intelligence in a century. I think that there is this idea that data, by inventing a certain type of AI, we invent this digital god. And I think the problem is, if you look at LLMs and you look at data to a certain extent, there is no digital god being formed.
Hmm.
If humans are trying to create something mimic humanity, we're just going to create another human, and that human is going to have all of the fallibilities, all of the
Hmm.
mistakes, all of the downfalls of its creator. In many ways, it's like Frankenstein. Like Frankenstein's monster looks at Victor Frankenstein and says, "You are what you made. I am what you made me. I am just a reflection of you and all of the best and worst aspects of me." And this is what the monster tells him. And he's like, you never understood me because you found me grotesque, but I am simply a reflection of you. I am your child." And in many ways, I think, like, for Sung, Data is his child, but it's actually his child. A human invented another human, but we have this expectation that this invented human is going to be a god, but humans can't invent gods any better than God can invent humans. If I may wrap it up.
That you, yes, I totally understand, and I'll make a comment after we finish to you, because
But
yeah.
I think data in certain ways, the beauty of data is in we're making a better human because this human is willing to take in from kind of a objective kind of third party distance his own actions in his own place. He has a
Right.
detachment of a computer system that can look at all the different variables and still apply it to himself. So, like,
Yes.
in some ways, he has the next step, but
Hmm.
he also doesn't. And in some ways, may never will, because I think if you look at AI development now, I think what reveals to me, at least, is that there are certain things that are still so far outside of our understanding that we're never going to reach them until we have that understanding.
Hmm.
Like, I don't think we reach a warp drive until we really understand what dark matter is. I don't think that we reach um AGI until we really understand the neurological aspects of the brain inside and out, down to not only brain chemistry but brain function, brain construction, how neurons work on almost an infinite level. I think there's so
Hmm.
many things that we need to do before we can
Hmm.
have an AI that leads to something like data. And I think by the 24th century, if you look at their medical technology, they can do that. If you look at their computer technology and their computing technology, they can do
Hmm.
that. But I think
Hmm.
the problem we have now, and I think what data has really highlighted for me in this new age of AI, is that we are trying to put the cart before not only the horse, but the entire goddamn farm. Like, we really need to have a foundation of not just a product or not just a tool, but an entire system and ecosystem
Right.
under it if you want this thing that you say is digital perfection. It just doesn't happen because one tool gets talked to a billion times or
Hmm.
script. Like, we're at a point now, and this is fascinating, and I think it's fascinating when you think about Data, who has access to all Starfleet knowledge, at least all the publicly verified stuff he's allowed to have access to. um we've already scraped the internet. There's no more information to scrape. we've
Hmm. Hmm.
we've literally fed all recorded human existence into these LLMs, and
Hmm.
they're not any more perfect. They're not performing any better, and they still need more data to consume if they're going to get to the next stage of
Right.
evolution.
Right.
But there's no data to consume. So,
Hmm.
like, where do they go from here?
Hmm.
Data has living human experiences that you can go to from time to time. I think one key aspect to making these LLMs super intelligent or giving them artificial general intelligence is that Data's embodiment and his ability to actually interact with human beings on a daily basis, it is really the thing that allows him to, reach this. I think if you want an LLM that's going to work or actually reach AGI, you actually have to put it in a body. You have to give it rules. You have to raise it. You have to train it. You have to almost treat it like Data, like a child.
I'm just thinking that can AI, if you ask the question in the right way, can they look at the total corpus of scientific data and make breakthroughs in our understanding of biological processes like neuroscience or physics, particularly quantum physics and things such as dark matter and dark energy?
Actually, no, it cannot. But that's the thing, and that's another limit of these AIs. These AIs only have the fullness of human intelligence, human art, all these things that have a plethora of mistakes, um, misappropriations, poor assumptions. There's just a lot of things in there that kind of just constrain it to where even data's not
Hmm.
perfect. Data has to
Hmm.
keep learning. Um,
Hmm.
I think the problem is you can't ask data what dark matter is because the people that invented data or created data don't know what dark matter is anymore yet. And until those
Yeah,
people,
right,
until the creators figure out what dark matter is, the child is not going to know what dark matter is.
right.
Like,
I see.
in some
Yeah.
ways, this is a case of egg, chicken and the egg. You really need to
Hmm.
have the egg first before you can have the
Hmm.
chicken. Um,
Right.
So, I think that's the really hard answer to that. I don't think that you can just let LLMs, especially, just go off on their own to solve a question. I think they can help solve questions, and but like things like dark matter, like they've already asked that question multiple times to AIs, and the AIs are like, "Well, this is the information that I have, and what I can tell you, and I can reverbalize or reconsider this for you 50 times. I still only know that dark matter is this theoretical thing that we're still working with." But
Right.
that's an interesting thing. Data only knows the theories that humans have and can only update them once humans figure out the theory. So,
Mhm.
it's one of those hard things I think is also very human about us and about the construction of AIs. Like, they're only as good as we are. And how good are we really?
Well, and it comes back to the humanness of data because he may have the capability as an android with a positronic brain to do research that would produce new information that could advance the understanding of something in the physical world and so on.
Right.
Which again, it shows his humanness.
Exactly. And I think you also see that from like the EMH and Voyager, who is
Mhm.
a who and the EMH and Voyager I think is actually interesting because as an AI, he pursues art, he pursues singing, he pursues
Right.
literature, he pursues human experience to better understand humanity and to grow himself. That is how
Yes.
the AI is growing himself. He's actually
Mhm.
going out and taking part in creativity. He's not just creating out of nothing.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that that in itself is a really important aspect that, I
Yeah.
think a lot of these AI, not CEO, I don't think the researchers forget about these things. I think the CEOs in the
Mhm.
drive to make $1 trillion or up the
Sure.
stock value say
Right.
these things.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
uh, Dad, I think, we're at the very end of this recording. I think the only thing that we have to talk about in the notes is Ferengis in this episode until DS9 and as forever are always going to be weirdly incompetent space pirates. Um, they're you really have to wait till DS9, folks, before Ferengis get more than that.
Right.
Um, but do you have anything that you want to add or bring up before
No,
before we call this?
I think we've covered it well.
Okay, fantastic. Dad, as always, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you,
And for
Jay.
everyone at home, I hope you all enjoyed this. This will be up very, very soon, probably this week. But until then,
Good.
everyone, happy New Year. I hope everyone has a great 2026. Dad hopes for you the same, and we hope that
Right.
for each other. But until then, folks, live long and
And
prosper.
prosper. Yes. Very good.
Have a good night. Okay. Uh,
We off.
oh, there.